Hi, my name is Sarina Jepsen, and I'm the Endangered Species Program Director at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. The goal of today's meeting is to identify the conservation objectives of a national native bee monitoring strategy and to articulate what data are needed to achieve these objectives. We hope to elicit ideas today from each of you in small and larger group discussions following each of these short presentations that have been selected to present a variety of viewpoints. The Xerces Society, named after the now extinct Xerces blue butterfly, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. We have several core programs, and both Rich Hatfield and myself work within the Endangered Species Program. Our approach to species conservation includes conducting applied research, and namely inventory, monitoring, and extinction risk assessment. We also run several community science programs. We develop technical guidance to inform habitat management and restoration. We engage in education, and we also use advocacy to get legal protection for vulnerable species. I thought it would be useful to briefly discuss the way in which we think about bee conservation and the strategies that we employ. I think about both conserving pollination services and a lot of existing bee conservation work, including that of our pollinator program to create flower-rich habitat on farms in order to maintain crop pollination falls into this category. And then there's also conserving individual species and preventing extinction. Some of the species conservation strategies that we employ include protecting populations and habitat essential to species survival, restoring or improving management of habitat essential to species survival, identifying and mitigating specific threats to species populations, understanding habitat requirements or associations, and then designing conservation interventions to address these factors, and identifying factors that limit population growth, and then again, designing conservation interventions specifically to address these factors. And there are both regulatory and voluntary approaches to advancing species conservation. From a regulatory perspective, there's tremendous value in adding species to lists, and specifically to the list of endangered species. The Endangered Species Act is arguably the most important piece of conservation legislation in history, because of its ability to directly protect species populations, as well as habitat in many cases, the recovery plan requirement. Also, funding can become available, though not nearly enough, for research and conservation interventions once species are listed and even when they are in the process of being considered for listing. And unfortunately, similar laws do not exist currently for protecting areas of high bee diversity or other priority habitats. Currently, we have only 9 ESA listed bees, though several others are being considered for listing, 2 bumblebees and 7 Hawaiian yellow-faced bees. Thought I would briefly discuss the information that was used to make the case for ESA listing in these 9 petitions. The Hawaiian yellow-faced bees, the Hylaeus, we submitted those petitions in 2009, and they were based primarily on work by Carl Magnacca documenting the current and historic distributions of each of the species on the Hawaiian Islands, their habitat associations, and a brief conservation status ranking based on factors like reliance on an endangered habitat or whether a species had disappeared from an island where it had previously occurred. Franklin's bumblebee petition was written and submitted in 2010, and we based that on a decade of survey work by Robin Thorpe at that time, documenting the species' disappearance from its historic sites. And then the Rusty Patch bumblebee petition was based on several pieces of information, notably a nationwide study led by Sidney Cameron that documented declines in this species and several other species, as well as the results of extinction risk assessments that Rich Hatfield did for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and a compilation of anecdotal reports submitted by community scientists and others about the species status and distribution across its range. And with that, I'm going to pass this off to Rich Hatfield, who's going to tell the story of how we've approached bumblebee conservation in North America over the last decade and a half.
Thanks, Rena, and hi, everybody. My name is Rich Hatfield. I'm a senior conservation biologist with the Xerces Society, and along with Sarina, help to direct our bumblebee conservation programs. I'm hoping to share with you some conservation achievements we've had over the last decade plus, in hopes that it would spur some conversation and maybe raise some questions and hopefully provide a couple of answers about how we might move forward with the National Bee Monitoring Network and how that could inform conservation efforts moving forward. Any bumblebee conservation story has to begin with Robin Thorpe, whose monitoring of bumblebee populations in Northern California and Southern Oregon really helped to raise the red flag about bumblebee decline in North America and Similarly, researchers in the East after that helped to recognize the decline in Bombus tricola and Bombus affinis, but certainly Robin's work was seminal in recognizing the need for a bumblebee decline or a bumblebee conservation effort. And it was around that time it came onto the awareness of the Xerces Society, where we started sort of two parallel campaigns. One was the advocacy campaign, and Sarina talked a lot about that already. I'm going to fill in the details about our data campaign and how we had feedback between our advocacy campaign and our data campaign to get to where we are today. So Sarina mentioned the Bombus franklini petition and other early work that we did. At the same time, she and Elaine Evans began a wanted campaign where they developed these posters for 4 different species, Bombus tricola, affinis, occidentalis, and franklini, and distributed these posters and asked folks to send emails with photos of bumblebees to us, so that we could try to verify those photos and see if the general public could help us to monitor bumblebee populations. And I think what we learned in that campaign is that indeed they can. First, I think we learned that people cared. We were receiving hundreds of emails a month, and only a small fraction of those were the target species. But ultimately, we had a lot of people that were interested and eventually shared a lot of records that really contributed to our knowledge of where, for instance, in this case, the western bumblebee was thriving. It was largely thought to have disappeared from the western portion of Oregon, Washington, and California, and our community scientists helped us to find it. And this allowed us to reach out to land managers and landowners and really advance conservation of that species. And so then we used the data from this wanted campaign, which was gathered by community scientists, to help inform our IUCN bumblebee assessments. And the IUCN bumblebee assessments were part of the Bumblebee Specialist Group, which is under the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And this group was formed by Sarina Jepsen and Paul Williams, which gathered a network of bumblebee scientists with the goal of assessing the extinction risk of all species in the world. And because we had a decent data set, we began here in North America. And the data set that we used was Leif Richardson's Bumblebees of North America data set that he gathered for the Bumblebees of North America guidebook, obviously with lots of different data contributors that I don't have time to acknowledge, but are certainly important to consider. And what we did with that data set is, for each species, one of the things that we did was we divided the database up into historic and current time periods, and then built range polygons for each of those time periods. And then we compared the historic to the current. And what you see here is the green is the historic and the purple is the current. And we're left with this, for some species, it appeared that they'd been disappeared from a significant portion of their historic range. And from this, we were left with this question of, well, is this truly a disappearance from those portions of the range, or is it just that nobody was looking? And we didn't really have a great way to assess that, because the data that we were using were not collected for this purpose. They were not collected for the purpose of assessing populations or looking at extinction risk. They were collected, well, we don't really know why they were collected. There's a lot of different reasons there. And so certainly imperfect data, but they were the best data that we had. So we moved forward, and we did this for every species in North America, and eventually found that around a quarter of them were facing some degree of extinction risk. And as I mentioned, an imperfect process, but one of the things that was encouraging is a parallel process that was going on over at NatureServe, found a similar proportion of bumblebees were facing extinction risk. So, we assessed a number of species as data deficient that they found were vulnerable. So we're looking at somewhere between a quarter and a third of bumblebee species facing some degree of extinction risk. And this knowledge helped us to understand that we needed to be monitoring more than 4 bumblebee species in North America. We needed more than a wanted campaign. We needed to monitor all species. In addition to that, we learned, through the IUCN assessments and the affinis petition that by only entering rare species into a database, you can actually make them look artificially common, especially when we rely on things like relative abundance, because we don't have true population estimates. And so at that time, we launched Bumblebee Watch, and Bumblebee Watch was launched alongside Wildlife Preservation Canada with Sheila Kola, who was there at the time, and used the platform of eButterfly to build this platform where we could monitor bumblebees across North America. At the same time we were launching this, we were continuing our advocacy campaign of reaching out to states that were updating their state wildlife action plans and encouraging them to list bumblebees as species of greatest conservation need. The data were used to inform the Species at Risk Act for Bombus bohemicus and Aphanus in Canada, as well as inform the listing decisions for Bombus aphanus and Bombus franklini in the US. And then we also conducted outreach with Forest Service biologists to get the western bumblebee listed as a sensitive species on forests throughout much of the West, which raises awareness about, for land managers and landowners, and also for policymakers. And meanwhile, we're continuing to collect data at Bumblebee Watch. And what we've learned is that we're doing a good job of gathering data on species at a continental scale. We're gathering thousands of records a year on 40 plus species. But what we learned when we looked at the data spatially is we were really just mapping human population density and learning which species live in those population density areas, which is important knowledge, but it doesn't really help us address these larger questions. And we still have these large data gap areas, especially in sort of the Intermountain West and Northern Great Plains and really the Southern US, much of the Southern US. And so at that time, we recognized that we needed to more systematically collect bumblebee data. And we looked for models and found the Vermont Bumblebee Atlas and the Maine Bumblebee Atlas and the work that Elaine Evans was doing in Minnesota. And we decided to launch the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, where we divided the states up into equal area grid cells. And we recruited community scientists to follow systematic effort-based surveys and collect data actually for the purpose of conservation decision-making. And this was a successful campaign. We collected more than 21,000 bumblebee observations of 26 species. More than 600 people contributed. We gathered 1,500 surveys. And all of this led to an increased understanding of at-risk bumblebees. And we're now using these data, for instance, to gather or to develop a bumblebee conservation strategy for 6 species in Washington. And this GIF will just show you, some idea of what bumblebee conservation looks like in North America. or I'm sorry, what bumblebee data coming into Bumblebee Watch looks like when we launch our Atlas project. So you can see when the Pacific Northwest lights up there, you see 3 consecutive years of data as the states fill in, and you see similar patterns start to emerge in Nebraska and Missouri as those Atlas projects launch. And then next year, we will be launching in California, as well as in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Kansas. So we'll be collecting, across a significant portion of the lower 48 states, we'll be collecting, systematic population level bumblebee data that can inform conservation decisions and assessments. And in addition to that, we're at a point where we've collected enough data in some of our Atlas projects that they're in turn now informing, the advocacy side of things. So data from the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas is informing the species status assessment for Bombus occidentalis, and the same will be true for Bombus sucklei and Bombus pennsylvanicus when those species come down the federal work plan pipeline in the years to come. And you add this data collection on top of the policy side, all of a sudden we're left with a fairly large continental scale bumblebee conservation program. And again, I hope some of this is helpful as we think about roadmaps and ways forward to monitor native bees in the US and Canada and North America, and in hopes that we can advance the conservation mission as well. So thanks for listening. I look forward to talking with some of you, at least about this in the breakout rooms that lie ahead. Thanks a lot.